Brace yourself. Because what you're about to witness is not gossip. It's the kind of celebrity implosion that doesn't just end relationships, it detonates reputations. For weeks, fans believed Kandi Burrus and Todd Tucker were being mature, keeping it private, walking away peacefully. That fantasy collapsed the second the courtroom doors shut and the truth walked in. What began as a silent filing on November 21, 2025 detonated into the most ruthless, reputation-destroying, network-rocking divorce Bravo has ever survived. This wasn't two people drifting apart. This was influence unraveling and somebody scrambling to bury what refused to stay buried. Because the moment Todd fired back, the temperature changed. Full custody, financial demands, child support battles, legal attacks on the prenup. Each filing louder, harsher, more dangerous than the one before it. Todd insisted he'd been cornered into signing, claimed he had no counsel, swore he had no control. But he never saw what Kandi unlocked on her phone, a single voice note buried deep that ended his entire defense in under 15 seconds. When the room heard Todd himself admit, "I'm doing this because I want to. Nobody forced me," the oxygen disappeared. The judge straightened. Todd went pale. His story collapsed in on itself like shattered glass under courtroom lights. And that was only Act 1. Because with every appearance came another revelation. Portia's name rising from nowhere. A rumored conversation that should never exist. Whispers of betrayal behind closed doors. Mama Joyce breaking her silence. Todd spiraling over Kandi's dominance. Old wounds tearing themselves open. And then the blow no one was ready for, Todd demanding DNA tests for Ace and Blaze. The gallery froze. Kandi cracked. And the internet caught fire. When the judge finally sealed the paperwork and closed the chapter, one thing was, it was the cruelest strike of the entire battle. And from that second, the case was no longer the same. Because the instant Todd challenged the blood of the children he'd raised, the atmosphere turned hostile. Compassion vanished. Objectivity melted. This stopped being law. This became punishment. But the moment that sealed everything came during the final appearance, the day the story collapsed under its own weight. Todd's attorney delivered the same theme again. The agreement had been forced. No legal guidance. No freedom to refuse. No understanding. He said it flatly. Rehearsed. Confident, as if it was untouchable. Then the judge looked at Kandi and asked one quiet question. "Can you dispute that?" She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She reached into her phone. One unlock. One folder. One file no one else had ever heard. The room filled with sound. Todd's voice, unshaken, unhurried, unmistakable. "I'm choosing this. No one pushed me. I want this. I love you. This is my decision." The silence slammed down like a wall. Todd went pale. His attorney dropped his notes. The judge leaned in slowly, listening twice with his eyes. Every narrative Todd had built collapsed instantly. When the judgment came, it wasn't theatrical. It was absolute. Marriage dissolved. No cheers. No final pleas. Just closure. Custody was postponed. The agreement remained intact. The children stayed with Kandi. Outside those doors, the public didn't wait for soundbites or press crews. They decided on their own. They watched the clip, counted the filings, remembered the DNA demand, replayed Mama Joyce's doubts. And one conclusion spread louder than any verdict. This wasn't pain. This wasn't loss. This wasn't survival. It was appetite. And it finally backfired. The impact of that courtroom recording didn't fade away. It didn't cool off. It didn't soften with time. It multiplied quietly, dangerously, like a fracture widening across glass already on the verge of imploding. What followed the finalized divorce wasn't relief. It was detonation. The kind that comes not from rage, but from exposure. Because once that stamp hit the paperwork, every illusion Todd leaned on began to collapse in public view, one unraveling move after another, until the question became impossible to ignore. Was this ever about love at all, or was it always about position? When Kandi exited the courthouse, flashbulbs erupted, but she never slowed down. She didn't answer. She didn't explain. She didn't smile. She didn't perform. She didn't even glance back. Her silence no longer looked fragile. It looked expensive, like something that had cost her everything. Her face wasn't carrying triumph. It carried depletion. A betrayal so old it no longer burned. It just pressed down. Todd came out moments later, eyes sharp, jaw clenched, fingers twitching like the verdict landed harder than he predicted. Not because a marriage had ended, but because authority had been pulled out of his hands in front of a courtroom full of witnesses. Lawyers. Cameras. A judge who had stopped believing him. He didn't lose a wife that day. He lost his footing. And it showed. But the real wreckage didn't happen under fluorescent lights. It happened after. In quiet offices. In message threads. In off-record phone calls. In arguments that bled through walls. In fans rewatching episodes like forensic analysts, reviewing every sideways remark, every uncomfortable joke, Every moment that aged badly overnight. Suddenly nothing sounded casual. Nothing felt accidental. Every smile looked timed. The first detonation came when sources revealed the DNA demand hadn't been a heat-of-the-moment explosion. It had been drafted, reviewed, finalized, written down long before anyone set foot inside that courtroom. Denial followed fast, until the paperwork surfaced. Then the internet turned savage. A man doubting the children he raised. The kids who called him dad. The kids who trusted him. The kids who never asked to stand in front of the wreckage. Then came the second wave. Old audio, deleted texts, archived voice notes. Not shouting matches. Not tabloid chaos. Precision. Cold lines. Strategic silences. Backhanded humor. Invisible cuts disguised as jokes. This wasn't a relationship exploding. It was one dissolving. People who once defended Todd started asking questions the public had avoided for years. Why did the custody war only ignite after the prenup collapse? Why did the DNA request surface when finances came under scrutiny? Why repeat the same story with such scripted confidence if the record for the first time ever? And once they did, everything sharpened into clarity. The agreement wasn't cruel. It was protection. The custody threat wasn't love. It was leverage. The pressure story wasn't pain. It was positioning. The DNA demand wasn't confusion. It was revenge. The financial fog wasn't chaos. It was concealment. And when the full story finally assembled itself, the shield around Todd disintegrated. He wasn't the man ambushed. He wasn't the broken husband. He wasn't the silent casualty. He was the architect who lost control of the outcome. The instant that recording emerged, the axis shifted. The courtroom stopped hearing coercion. It started seeing choreography. The girls stopped seeing a father overwhelmed by conflict. They saw someone choosing offense over repair. The audience stopped watching a marriage fall apart. They watched a long-running collapse finally surface from hiding. The divorce decree didn't bring peace. It delivered daylight. Proof that some bonds aren't destroyed, they're exposed. And this one wasn't peeled back carefully. It was torn apart by records that erased every alternative interpretation. Some marriages end with paperwork. This one ended with evidence. And that evidence led to one conclusion: love didn't collapse. Character did. The air never cleared. Not after the ruling. Not after the judge closed the folder. Not after the courtroom emptied. Something invisible stayed suspended between their names. The story didn't end where the marriage ended. It thickened. It sank. It followed them into places court orders can't reach. Because most separations stop at paper, but this one kept spilling into everything else. People thought there would be quiet once it was done. A pause. A retreat. Time to breathe. But the silence that arrived wasn't gentle, it was charged. Tight. Dangerous. The kind of quiet that means the truth hasn't finished speaking. Only the law has. And law never tells the full story. Weeks passed, and scattered fragments started emerging from behind the scenes. Not dramatic leaks. Not headline bombs. Just details slipping through people who couldn't stay silent anymore. And it became impossible to ignore what had been hiding in plain sight. The final hearing was only the peak. The collapse itself had been growing underneath for a long time. One source said that after the ruling was announced, Todd didn't stand up right away. He stayed frozen, eyes locked on the table, like the verdict had knocked the breath out of him. Not because he still wanted the marriage, but because he hadn't expected the version of himself he sold to the court to disappear so violently. The recording didn't just dismantle his argument. It erased the persona he'd been building. The wronged man. The cornered husband. The misunderstood partner. Gone in seconds. Kandi never looked his way. Not when she rose. Not when she left. Not when flashes burst down the hallway behind her. It wasn't rage. It wasn't spite. It was something colder. Grief that had gone numb. The kind that comes from realizing you were trying to fix something while the other person was quietly designing an escape. Outside the courthouse, there was no grace period. The internet turned that recording into a spotlight and held Todd under it. Bloggers and analysts picked apart every syllable. They slowed the audio, replayed the pauses, counted the certainty in his voice, studied the calm, the ease, the lack of conflict on his face. Every frame contradicted everything he'd sworn to before a judge. Then another revelation hit. Reports surfaced showing Todd had financial interests no one in court ever saw coming. Projects he hadn't openly shared. Accounts he managed privately. Investments he protected with more urgency than the relationship itself. The documents didn't accuse him of crimes. They didn't have to. The timeline told the story better than any charge ever could. Gradually, the conversation shifted. People stopped being shocked. They started recognizing patterns. Mama Joyce's old warnings resurfaced, no longer as drama, but as foresight. That maybe he was never building a future, only constructing a soft landing. A backup life. And once that idea took hold, past episodes transformed in real time. Scenes once dismissed as tension suddenly looked like foreshadowing. Jokes sounded rehearsed. Comments aged poorly overnight. Then the family fractures reopened. Riley kept quiet publicly, but her actions spoke loudly. She liked posts calling out emotional manipulation, shared quotes about choosing peace, posted lyrics about betrayal without naming names. Kayla answered in her own way, cryptic captions about loyalty, about being misunderstood, about people judging from the outside. They weren't attacking each other. They were drifting apart where everyone could see it happen. And then there were whispers no one wanted to repeat at first. That in the final months, Todd had pulled away from the children. That his presence had shrunk. That warmth had disappeared. A caregiver anonymously described moments of emotional absence. Cold reactions. Irritation at noise. Missing engagement. Nothing criminal. Nothing brutal. Just empty. Heavy. Disconnected. And slowly, the public started to understand why the judge made the choice to keep the children with Kandi. The DNA demand refused to fade. It became a scar in the story. Fans couldn't understand how someone could raise children and then doubt them in public unless the goal was destruction. The judge dismissed it. The internet didn't. It became more than a request. It became a symbol of how far the war had gone. And while the backlash swallowed him online, Todd didn't disappear. He recalibrated, changed attorneys, filed motions, reassessed custody tactics, watched silently. It didn't feel like healing. It felt like reloading. Kandi moved the opposite direction, into stability, into schedules, into school nights, into work, into being present even when it hurt. No interviews, no performative speeches. She let the documents speak. She let the recording stand. She let actions reveal themselves. She didn't win because she fought harder. She won because she stopped fighting someone who had already turned against her. But the quietest devastation came last, when the children learned about the DNA demand. Ace didn't understand the words, but felt the change. Blaze asked questions no one was ready to answer. The divide didn't stop with paperwork. It poured into bedtimes, into doubts, into trust. That part of the story never made blogs. It lived behind doors, in whispers, in rooms that no court could enter. The public verdict hardened the moment viewers went back through earlier seasons, old interviews, and forgotten red carpet clips. What once passed as charm now looked like calculation. What once sounded playful now felt deliberate. People started noticing how often Todd spoke in numbers instead of emotions. How frequently he measured worth in leverage. How easily love turned into accounting. The internet didn't just reinterpret the relationship, it reassembled the entire marriage through a colder lens. Then came the realization that ended all debate. The agreement was never a problem until the exit was. Only when divorce was on the horizon did it suddenly be. By the end, it was never about damage totals. It wasn't about victory or defeat. It wasn't about tears, exits, or endurance. It was about design. And design always reveals itself when no one thinks it will. The truth didn't erupt. It didn't explode. It didn't beg to be heard. It whispered permanently. In a recording made without pressure. In words said without hesitation. In a voice that sounded certain. A voice that agreed and later denied. A clip that demolished months of strategy. A moment that proved this wasn't a marriage undone by betrayal. It was dismantled by intention. The paperwork wasn't the heartbreak. Discovering the hidden plan was. Here is the part most people refuse to accept. The moment the door shut and the ruling became permanent, nothing actually finished. The documents only documented what had already collapsed, and every quiet second afterward screamed louder than any argument ever broadcast. You witnessed a relationship dissolve in daylight, but the real damage happened out of view. Loyalty didn't vanish in a moment. Affection didn't die in one ruling. What destroyed everything was purpose brought into the open. That recording didn't merely challenge a statement, it detonated a plan. The custody fight wasn't driven by love, it was territory claimed. The DNA demand wasn't doubt, it was damage delivered deliberately. With every motion that followed the filing, a hidden narrative stepped forward into daylight. And once it did, the disguise could never be worn again. So the question left standing is simple and terrifying. What now? What grows after a foundation caves in? What does childhood look like when the story you inherit is written in court ink? This is no longer entertainment. It's impact. It's the moment when attachment becomes strategy because it was never anchored deeply enough to endure pressure. If you think a verdict equals an ending, you're only seeing paper, not consequence. Courts close cases, not wounds. The next phase won't play out in transcripts. It will unfold in habits, distances, and realizations the spotlight will never reach. Keep watching. Keep listening. Stories like this don't disappear. They reverberate. Because when a truth this dense finally breaks free, it doesn't fade into quiet. It reshapes everything: the past, the intention, and every version of the story people once trusted.